Her screams echoed off the stone walls, like a curse no priest could lift. Blood pooled beneath the heavy oak bed, soaking into the silk sheets that once belonged to a queen, now torn by agony and fear. No one moved, not the midwife with shaking hands, not the physician murmuring Latin prayers he didn't believe, and certainly not the king, who stood behind the door listening. But forbidden to enter, this was not childbirth, this was a royal performance, and it could kill her. It was the summer of 1678, and Queen Maria Anna of Spain was about to bring another heir into a world that cared more for his bloodline than his mother's survival. The royal birthing chamber was not a sanctuary, it was a stage, a prison, and a battlefield all at once. The room itself was a suffocating horror. Windows had been sealed to keep out bad air, what they called miasma, believing it caused illness. The result, stale humid air, thick with sweat, incense, and the stench of human suffering. No ventilation, no silence, just whispers and judgment. Always judgment. Maria lay on her back, her belly distended, her wrists bruised from gripping the bedposts in silence for hours. She wasn't allowed to scream. That would be unseemly for a queen. Only peasant women screamed. Royal women were expected to birth like marble statues, still noble and invisible in their pain. A curtain separated her from the crowd gathered at the far end of the room. Yes, a crowd. Courtiers, doctors, ladies-in-waiting, even rival nobles, stood in attendance, not to support her, but to witness, to ensure the child was truly hers, that no impostor switched a stillborn infant with a peasant baby in the dead of night. Her privacy was a casualty of power. They called it lying in, a tradition that forced noblewomen into bed 6 weeks before birth. The doors were closed, the room darkened, and the woman kept away from fresh air, movement, or sunlight. The theory, it would calm the womb. The truth, it bred infection, depression, and death. But there was no refusing tradition, not even if it killed you. Push, the midwife whispered now, wiping sweat from the queen's brow. Your Majesty, you must push. Maria clenched her teeth, vision swimming in and out of focus. She had already given birth to 2 daughters, both dead before their second birthdays. The pressure to produce a living male heir pressed down on her harder than the contractions did. Failure wasn't just personal. It was political. And the king. He wasn't allowed in, not because they respected her modesty, but because men were barred from the room unless they were physicians. Husbands weren't supposed to witness their wives' pain. It might make them see her differently, like a human. But childbirth in royal circles wasn't about humanity. It was about dynasty. Physicians stepped forward, now gloved hands, reeking of vinegar and garlic, the protective mixture applied to fend off bad spirits. He had not washed his hands. No one did. Germs were still an abstract idea, scoffed at by court doctors clinging to ancient theories. He examined her without consent. His diagnosis was swift and chilling. The child is turned. It will not come naturally. Maria sobbed, biting her lip until it bled. The physician reached for a cold iron instrument, a hook. If the baby could not be born alive, it would be removed in pieces. A common practice. The life of the queen, or the life of the heir. Sometimes neither survived. But just then, a shrill cry broke through the haze. The baby was crowning. For a moment, time collapsed. Everyone leaned in. The curtain was pulled slightly aside. This was the moment they had waited for. One final push. A baby boy, blue, silent. UNMOVING. The midwife slapped his back with a trembling hand. Once, twice, he let out a weak, broken cry. Cheers erupted in the corner. A boy, a male heir. The queen's agony forgotten. But Maria. Her face turned away from the child, eyes fixed on the ceiling, pale, silent, motionless. The midwife didn't dare speak because now the real horror would begin. The royal postpartum ritual, as Maria was cleaned without soap, only herbs and cloth sands swaddled in sweat-soaked linens. The child was taken away, not to her arms, but to the wet nurse. A stranger would nurse the future king. Queens were not permitted to breastfeed. It was seen as too animalistic, too draining. Her job was to recover and prepare to do it all again. But how could she recover? In a room like this, the sheets would not be changed. The windows would not be opened. She would not walk for weeks. Infection thrived. Women died often, quietly. Maria closed her eyes and waited for the fever to come, and it did. But what no one expected was what she would do when it finally broke. The fever arrived in waves. First came the chills, violent, teeth-clattering, tremors that made her feel like she was drowning in ice despite the stifling heat of the room. Then came the fire, licking her skin from within, melting her bones, warping her breath into something jagged and desperate. Maria couldn't speak. Her lips cracked with dryness, her vision blurred. The faces above her became spectresome, praying, others simply watching. She could hear the whispers, childbed fever, another one, it's the will of God. But Maria wasn't ready to die. Not like this. Not in this stinking chamber with its blood-soaked sheets, its walls dripping with incense and politics. Not with her son only hours old and already pried from her arms. On the fourth day, as the fever climaxed and her soul hovered somewhere between this world and the next, something cracked inside her, not her body, but her spirit. Something quiet and fierce. She woke on the fifth day, against all odds, pale, weak, but breathing. They called it a miracle, but Maria knew better. She had seen the darkness, touched it, and come back. But survival was not enough. Something had changed. She had changed. In the weeks that followed, as the court celebrated the infant heir with parades and parties, Maria sat in the shadows of her chamber, staring at the cradle she was not allowed to touch. And as she sat, she began to plan. She could not change the system overnight. She could not erase the centuries of suffering carved into the bodies of royal women. But she could plant a seed. She could make sure this horror, this suffocating theater of pain, was not her legacy. When she was finally allowed to stand, weeks later, she called her most trusted lady in waiting to her bedside and spoke for words that would ripple through generations. Write down everything, and they did, in secret. Every detail of the childbirth, the filth, the onlookers, the fever, the fear. They wrote it not as gossip but as testimony. A document of royal suffering, not meant for public scandal, but for private reform. Maria met with the royal physician in quiet fury. Not with screaming, but with facts. She asked him why he did not wash his hands. He laughed. She did not. She demanded changes for her next lying in. Ventilation, clean sheets. No spectators. She would choose the midwife, not the court. And if the king disagreed, she said nothing. But the look in her eyes was a prophecy. Months turned into years. Her son, Felipe, grew strong. And as he did, Maria took control of her health, her staff, her space. She began corresponding with other queens and duchessizing them about their birthing rituals, sharing her experience, quietly forming a network of women bound not by ceremony, but by blood and survival. It took decades, but the tide turned. By the early 18th century, royal birthing rooms began to change. Windows opened. Midwives were trained. Curtains were closed to the crowd. Privacy, slowly, returned. And though no one ever published Maria's testimony in her lifetime, copies circulated in hushed corridors and quiet studies. They called it the Queen's Letter. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a beginning. A quiet rebellion from a woman who had nearly died in silence and refused to let the next queen suffer the same fate. And today, that legacy lives on in ways you may never have realized. When modern birthing rites discuss the importance of privacy, sanitation, consent, those ideas weren't born from textbooks. They were carved from the screams of women like Maria, from rooms where life and death danced inches apart, from the rot and ritual of royal childbirth. So next time someone paints history's queens as fragile dolls, cloaked in lace and luxury, remember this: they bled, they broke, they endured, and in their darkest hour, they still found a way to fight back. If this story moved you, if You felt the weight of Maria's suffering and the quiet power of her rebellion. Don't let her story fade. Like this video to honor the forgotten women of history. Comment below. What shocked you the most about royal childbirth? Subscribe for more untold cinematic stories from the shadows of the past. And share this with someone who still believes queens had it easy. History isn't clean, but sometimes, in the mess we find the truth.